Have you ever noticed that we are surrounded by voices, messages, images, invitations, and yet something inside us insists on whispering, "I'm alone"? It's almost a cruel paradox. We live in the most connected period in human history: social media, instant messaging apps, virtual communities, digital dating, and yet we've never experienced so much loneliness. But maybe the real question isn't why are we alone, but rather, what is our loneliness trying to tell us? Imagine for a moment, you're in a cafe surrounded by people, all immersed in their screens, laughing at jokes that don't belong in the physical space, but in a virtual universe. You're there present, but the atmosphere feels cold. You can even talk, exchange words, but nothing seems to touch the essence. This experience is not unique to you, it is almost a symptom of modernity. And here's the paradox. It has never been so easy to communicate, and it has never been so difficult to feel understood. Many believe that isolation is a social failure, a sign that you don't know how to relate. But what if it's the opposite? What if your isolation is a mirror that reflects something deeper? A sensitivity that finds no shelter in trivial conversations? A mind that seeks more than the surface? Nietzsche, in his fierce writing, said that loneliness is not a burden, but the place where the individual confronts his own greatness. Jung, on the other hand, believed that loneliness arises not from the absence of people, but from the difficulty of communicating what is essential. Both reveal to us that isolation is not just emptiness, it is revelation. Think about social media. Every day, billions of people expose chosen pieces of themselves. A digital theater in which everyone dons the mask they believe will be most acceptable. It's as if everyone is shouting, "See me, validate me, confirm that I exist." And in this deafening noise, whoever dares to remain silent feels invisible. But invisibility is sometimes a form of protection, because being surrounded by stimuli does not mean being connected. And maybe isolation is the body saying, "Stop, breathe, you don't need to dance in this show to exist." The Danish philosopher Kierkegaard wrote that anguish is the vertigo of freedom. Perhaps our loneliness is precisely that, the vertigo of realizing that we don't fit into the mold offered. And this realization hurts, because the modern world has convinced us that being alone is failure, when in fact, it can be the first sign that you're beginning to see. And here's a curious detail. Many people who experience isolation are the same ones who feel the most, think the most, and observe the most. They're not cold, distant, or insensitive. In fact, they're the opposite. They feel so much that the world seems too noisy. And in this excess, they prefer silence. Perhaps your isolation is less about a lack of friends, and more about an unconscious search for authenticity. Maybe he's trying to show you that you weren't born to be just another voice in the choir, but someone who needs to learn to hear your own echo. And that brings us to a question that will accompany this entire script. Is your isolation a problem? Or is it a mirror that reveals who you really are? To understand this answer, we need to look within and realize that isolation often does not speak of the absence of others, but of the intensity of our own sensitivity. If, up until now, something I've said has touched you, maybe it's because a part of you already knew it but needed to hear it. This channel exists to remind you that you're not alone in this quest. So, if you feel this conversation resonates with you, subscribe and continue walking with me in this exploration of the human paradox. Have you ever noticed that the people who isolate themselves the most are often the ones who feel the most? It's curious, because the world often interprets loneliness as coldness, withdrawal, or disinterest, but in reality, it can arise from the opposite, from a heart too sensitive to bear so much noise. Psychologist Carl Jung believed that loneliness comes not from the absence of companionship, but from the inability to share what is essential. In other words, you can be surrounded by people and still feel alone, simply because what is deepest within you finds no welcome. This is the dilemma of the sensitive, feeling beyond the surface and therefore having difficulty fitting into a world that celebrates superficiality. Imagine someone at a party. Everyone's laughing, chatting about trivialities, sharing memes, and commenting on what they've seen online. But this person, even while laughing along, feels like they're acting out a role. Deep down, she would like to ask something like, "Are you also afraid of the void? Do you also wonder if all this has meaning?" But she knows that the table will fall silent, that people will laugh without understanding. So instead of speaking, she chooses silence. And little by little, this silence turns into isolation. Not because she doesn't want to connect, but because the depth of her inner world doesn't find space to exist. There is a detail that few realize. Isolation in this case is not a social failure but a psychological mirror. It shows who you are. It reveals that you were not born to live only on the surface. It shows that your sensitivity is, at the same time, your strength and your burden. Nietzsche said that he who fights monsters must be careful not to become a monster himself. Perhaps we can adapt. Those who feel too much need to learn to transform this sensitivity into wisdom, so that it doesn't become a prison. Isolation can be a sign that you're carrying the weight of feeling deeply in a world that prefers to numb you. That's why so many take refuge in books, music, movies, or even silently writing in a diary. It's not just about liking art, it's about finding a space where sensitivity is not a mistake but a language. Art embraces what everyday conversation rejects. And maybe that's why you feel so out of place in crowds, because your perception goes beyond the visible. You notice the pauses between words, the pain hidden behind a smile, the contradiction in the promises of the modern world. And that's no small feat, it's a rare gift, but also a heavy burden. But here's the question, what do you do with that burden? If you reject it, loneliness becomes bitter. If you accept it, she can become fertile. Because isolation, when faced head-on, not only reveals your sensitivity, it can become a path to self-understanding. Jung said that encountering one's own shadow is an essential step in individuation, the process of becoming whole. Perhaps your isolation is precisely the gateway to this encounter. Perhaps it's life's way of pushing you inward so that you discover not only the weight of feeling, but also the power to transform that feeling into creation, into meaning, into something that resonates beyond you. And here comes an inevitable hook. If your sensitivity isolates you, could it also be what can save you? Could the burden of thinking and feeling too much be not just a curse, but also the beginning of a greater freedom? There is a kind of loneliness that does not arise from a lack of people, but from an excess of thoughts. Perhaps you know this feeling well, the mind never silences. While others seem to live with ease, you analyze every detail, every gesture, every unspoken word. The world for you is never just what it seems, it's always a puzzle to be deciphered. And that's exactly where the isolation begins. Because overthinking can be like living in a hall of mirrors. Every idea is reflected in 1,000 others, every emotion multiplies into questions, every silence becomes a labyrinth. The result? A life rich in insights but difficult to share. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard described this experience as existential angst, the price of being too conscious. He believed that when we perceive the vastness of human freedom, we feel dizzy. Overthinking is, at bottom, perceiving too much. And perceiving too much inevitably leads to distance. Have you ever tried to talk about your deepest thoughts in casual conversation? You mention your doubts about the meaning of life and soon someone responds, "Relax, you think too much. Let's talk about something else." And in that moment, you realize that your inner world does not fit into the frame of superficiality. The analytical mind is like a lamp that never goes out. While many fall asleep in comfortable certainties, you remain awake, questioning, turning over possibilities, imagining futures, revisiting past. And the more clarity you seek, the more you realize that reality is made of shadows. Nietzsche said that to think deeply is to wound oneself fatally. This sentence sounds harsh, but it captures a truth. The more awareness, the more vulnerability. Overthinking reveals contradictions that others prefer to ignore. And by revealing it, he isolates himself. But here's the irony. Overthinking can be a burden, but it's also a form of freedom. Because if most people live trapped in superficial certainties, it is intense thought that opens the door to authenticity. Yes, it pushes away. Yes, it hurts. But it is he who allows you to see beyond the veil. Perhaps this is why many great thinkers lived in isolation. Not because they rejected the world, but because they saw it in layers that others couldn't bear to see. Schopenhauer, for example, believed that solitude was the philosopher's natural destiny, not as a punishment, but as an inevitable consequence of seeing life without illusions. And maybe you feel this way too. It's not that you want to be alone, but the weight of your thinking doesn't resonate with most people. It's like trying to explain a complex dream to someone who just wants to hear the punchline. The result is silence. And silence, over time, becomes a habit. But there's a hidden choice here. You can let overthinking be just a mental prison, or you can turn it into creation, reflection, expression. Because if thought isolates, expression liberates. A mind that never rests can become a suffocating labyrinth, but it can also become an inexhaustible source of meaning, as long as you have the courage to share it, even if not with everyone, but with those who know how to listen. And here the question arises. Is your isolation just a consequence of overthinking? Or is it the call to transform that burden into wisdom? We live in an era where everything needs to be seen to exist. If it's not registered, shared, liked, commented on, it almost seems like it didn't happen. Debord called this the society of the spectacle, a world in which we no longer live the experience itself, but the image of the experience. And in this scenario, isolation takes on a new face. You can be surrounded by hundreds of digital friends, receive messages every day and still feel empty. Why? Because deep down what we are offered is not connection but performance. It is not a meeting but an exhibition. Think about how we behave on social media. We choose the best photo, the best angle, the most impactful phrase. We cut the silence, the mistakes, the tears. We build a character of ourselves that is more desirable, more accepted, more marketable. And in the midst of this collective performance, anyone who dares to show vulnerability runs the risk of being ignored, ridiculed, or discarded. Bauman called this liquid modernity, relationships that don't have time to solidify, connections as quick as clicks, fragile as glass. We live surrounded by people but we only touch the surface of each one. And little by little, this superficiality suffocates us. This is where silent alienation arises. You participate in social theater, but you feel like you don't belong. Laughs at the jokes, posts the photos, responds to the messages, but inside something whispers, "That's not you." And when that inner voice gets too loud, you pull away. Not because he rejects others, but because he realizes that this game exacts too high a price. The price of authenticity. Isolation, in this case, can be an act of resistance. While everyone rushes to show off, you choose to observe. While everyone screams to be seen, you choose silence. And in that silence there is a form of freedom. Nietzsche said that the true free spirit is the one who dares to walk alone, not out of contempt for others, but out of fidelity to himself. In the society of the spectacle, perhaps isolation is the ultimate gesture of honesty. But here's the paradox. If you stay away from social theater, you risk feeling invisible. And if you participate, you risk losing yourself. This is the dilemma of modernity, living among everyone but not feeling like you belong anywhere. And perhaps that is exactly what his isolation reveals. Not just a personal trait but a reaction to the world we live in. A silent response to a scenario where everyone is shouting, but few are actually listening. And here is the question that prepares our next step. If isolation can be a mirror of sensitivity, and also a reaction to the modern spectacle, could it not, at the same time, be an unconscious choice for authenticity? What if your isolation isn't an accident, but a choice you haven't yet realized you've made? A silent, invisible choice, hidden behind the feeling of inadequacy. Perhaps by moving away from trivial conversations, by refusing invitations that don't resonate, by preferring silence to noise, you are, without realizing it, choosing to preserve something much more valuable: your authenticity. Nietzsche spoke of free spirit. He who dares to walk outside the flock, not because he despises others, but because he cannot bear to betray himself. In practice, this means that loneliness is often not a punishment, but the price of integrity. And maybe that's what your isolation is saying about you. That even without words, you already refuse to live a life that isn't yours. Think for a moment. How many times have you said no to situations where everyone expected you to say yes? How many times have you felt awkward, out of place, inadequate, and yet relieved that you didn't have to wear a mask? These small choices, which seem like mere withdrawal, can actually be acts of courage. Because it's easy to belong when all they ask for is a mask. It's difficult to stay true to the face behind it. Of course, this loyalty comes at a cost. Isolation hurts. It can bring a feeling of emptiness, a lack of belonging, and excessive silence. But at the same time, it preserves the possibility of something that few people truly know: genuine encounter. When you don't mold yourself just to be accepted, you create space for those who connect with who you really are to emerge. It's not a crowd. There are not thousands of friends. But these are encounters that touch deeply because they are born from truth. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl said that man can endure almost anything except meaninglessness. And maybe your isolation is the way your soul screams, "I do not accept a life without truth." Even if it means walking alone for long stretches of the path. And here comes a change in perspective. Isolation in this case is not just absence. It's a choice. It's the unconscious saying that authenticity is worth more than easy acceptance. But this choice doesn't have to be just defensive. It can be turned into construction. When you understand that solitude can be fertile, that it opens space to create, reflect, write, understand, it stops being just a symptom and becomes a tool. And perhaps this is exactly what differentiates those who lose themselves in solitude from those who find themselves in it. The awareness that being alone can also be an act of freedom. And so we come back to the question: what is your isolation saying about you? Is he trying to reveal that you are freer and truer to yourself than you realize? We return to the question that started this journey. What does your isolation say about you? So far, we have seen that loneliness can be a reflection of sensitivity, overthinking, perception of the modern world, and even an unconscious choice of authenticity. It is, at the same time, a mirror and a path, and perhaps that is exactly what makes it so paradoxical. If you feel this isolation, don't interpret it simply as a lack of company. See it as a map of your interior, showing the depths of your mind and the contours of your heart. It reveals that you feel too much, think too much, perceive too much. That you were not born to settle for superficiality. That you seek meaning even when society prefers distraction. But isolation also brings an opportunity, the opportunity to find yourself. While many rush to fill the void with noise and screens, you have the chance to understand yourself, to reflect on your own life, to build meaning within the silence. It is in this space that authenticity flourishes. And therein lies the deepest paradox. Your isolation, which seems to distance you from the world, can also bring you closer to what really matters. It's not just a barrier, it's a portal. It's not just pain, it's revelation. Nietzsche wrote that whoever struggles with depth must learn to embrace solitude. Perhaps this is what your own experience is trying to teach you. Solitude is not a punishment but a form of freedom, an opportunity to become whole. So if you feel out of place, if you feel different, if you feel alone, fear not. Perhaps your isolation is not the end of the story, but the space where your most authentic story begins to be written. And if this conversation has touched something within you so far, perhaps it makes sense to continue walking this path of deep reflection. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we explore the paradoxes that make each of us human. And to conclude, I leave you with this reflection. Maybe loneliness is not just a void to be filled, but the mirror where you finally find your truth.